If you think that a flashback is something you remember, you're probably using flashbacks in the wrong way. So how should you use flashbacks in your memoir? The answer to this coming up. Let me start with a few examples that I often see in my students' assignments. Suddenly, I remembered being 6 years old. I recalled a time in the past when the kids had been cruel to me. My mind flashed back to the day I was fired. So if you've ever set up your flashback, similar to the examples I just gave you, you're already creating structural problems for yourself. In this video, I'm going to talk about what a flashback really is, how to get into a flashback so you don't confuse your reader, and how to get out of your flashback and return to your main story. First, I want to quickly tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Wendy Dale. I'm a Random House author and the creator of Memoir Writing for Geniuses. Okay, let's get into this. First thing I want you to keep in mind is that a flashback is not something that your narrator is actually remembering. I think one reason that my students think this is because of the way flashbacks are used in movies. So we're in the scene and all of a sudden there's a shot of the character remembering, and then we get into the flashback.
I never met my birth parents. There was a car accident. I'm told it was a beautiful Belgian day. The smell of waffles.
But flashbacks don't work this way in memoir. In memoir, a flashback is basically an aside. It's a story from your past that is somehow relevant to the main storyline. This will make more sense when I get into the next section and explain how to get into flashbacks in your book. So, I just said that a flashback is a story from the past that is relevant to something happening in your main storyline. So in order to get into a flashback, you need to do two things. First of all, something has to happen in your main storyline. And second, you need to make a point related to what just happened, a point that is relevant to the flashback. Does that sound confusing? It won't by the time I'm finished giving you the examples. So this first example is from Somebody's Daughter by Ashley Seaford. I rested my forehead against the bus window, careful to avoid the red bar warning that this was an emergency exit. One time on a bus ride before this one, my grandmother told me that if I fell asleep against the bar, I might slip out of the window and into the road before anyone would notice I was gone. As she said it, I could see it, my small sleeping body tumbling from the side of the bus. So let me stop right there. Let's look at how she gets into the flashback. So we have two rules here. You want for something to happen in your main storyline, and then you want to make a point that gets us into the flashback. So let's see how she does this. What happens in her main storyline before she gets into the flashback? I rested my forehead against the bus window, careful to avoid the red bar warning that this was an emergency exit. So she rests her forehead against the window and avoids the red bar warning. That's what happens in her main storyline. Now, what is the point she's going to make that's going to get us into the flashback? Well, it's related to what just happened in the main storyline. One time on a bus ride before this one, my grandmother told me that if I fell asleep against the bar, I might slip out of the window and into the road before anyone would notice I was gone. So there she makes a point which gets us into the flashback. Okay, I'll just finish reading the flashback for you. It's very short. As she said it, I could see it. My small sleeping body tumbling from the side of the bus, falling into the traffic, smashed into the road, and all the bus patrons, driver included, continuing toward the Hoosier estate, with no real sense that a little girl who had just been real and alive beside them was now dead and gone behind them. I taught myself to sleep lightly, to feel the difference between the window and the bar on my face. As I try to sleep now, the light vibration of driving down the highway soothing me, I dream of the tea set I'd left behind and the farm where I could be anything and anywhere I wanted with a little imagination. Okay, we're going to talk about getting out of flashbacks later in this video. For now, let me just give you another example so you really grasp this concept of something happening in your main storyline and then making a point that gets us into the flashback. This is from Where You End and I Begin by Lee McLaren. So let me set up the scene just a little bit for you. So Lee's hamster, whose name is Adrian, was just found by her dog in the snow. So her dog has come in with her nearly lifeless hamster. Oh, and by the way, this starts with her mother speaking. "Oh, Lee, I don't think he's going to make it. The best thing to do would be to put him out of his misery." "What? No. Maybe you should call your father." I'd once watched my dad place an injured sparrow behind the tire of his Celica in reverse. He was gentle with animals, but he'd worked weekends at a funeral home in high school and wasn't squeamish about death. He said it was cruel to let an animal suffer. Adrian was suffering. I could see that. There must be something we can do. My mind raced. Okay, so what happens in the main storyline? Her mother suggests putting the hamster out of its misery. And what is the first point that the author makes to get us into the flashback? Once my father put an animal out of its misery. So one thing I want you to notice here, she doesn't say, as my mother is talking, I think back to the time that my father put a sparrow out of its misery. She doesn't need to. This is not a memory. Instead, she makes a point that is related to what is happening in her main storyline. So it's really important to make this point, or you will get your structure off track. You will confuse your reader. They won't know why you're giving us the flashback. So what I want you to keep in mind is that you need to make this point at the very beginning of your flashback, not at the end. In a short flashback, honestly, it's not that critical, but I intentionally chose really short samples just for the sake of this video. Most flashbacks are much longer than the samples I'm giving you here. So when you have a long flashback and you don't put that point at the point that you're going to make at the beginning of the flashback to give this flashback a reason to exist, your reader's going to get frustrated and confused and is going to think, wait, why is the author telling me this? So you want to make that point, and then you can start your flashback from the beginning. I have one more example for you. Before I get into it, I'd be grateful if you hit like and subscribe. Also, if you'd like a free class on memoir writing, there's a link right below this video. So this is the third example. It is from Wild. Let me get right into it, and then we'll analyze a little bit what Cheryl Strait is doing. The doctor shook his head sadly and pressed on. He had a job to do. They could try to ease the pain in her back with radiation, he offered. Radiation might reduce the size of the tumors that were growing along the entire length of her spine. I did not cry. I only breathed, horribly, intentionally, and then forgot to breathe. I'd fainted once, furious, age 3, holding my breath because I didn't want to get out of the bathtub, too young to remember it myself. What did you do? What did you do? I'd asked my mother all through my childhood, making her tell me the story again and again, amazed and delighted by my own impetuous will. She'd held out her hands and watched me turn blue, my mother had always told me. She waited me out until my hands fell into her palms and I took a breath and came back to life. Breathe. Can I ride my horse? My mother asked the real doctor. She sat with her hands folded tightly together and her ankles hooked one to the other. Let's analyze this one. Hopefully you're getting the gist of this by now. What happens in the main storyline? When I get more bad news from my doctor, I forget to breathe. And what is the point she makes to get us into the flashback? Once I held my breath so long, I fainted. So we have an event and we have a point that is related to that event that is going to set up the flashback that's going to give this flashback a reason to exist. So what's the most important thing to keep in mind? Make that point at the very beginning of your flashback. It will make the flashback relevant in your reader's mind, and they won't ask, why is the author telling me this? So now you know how to get into a flashback, but one of the biggest challenges is actually getting out of the flashback and returning to your main storyline. So how do you do this? So I've seen writers try out things like, suddenly I snapped out of my reverie. But that doesn't really work because your reader is not thinking of this as something you're remembering. This is just a story from your past that's related to what is going on in your main storyline. So how do you actually get out of a flashback effectively? I'm going to give you 3 tips for doing this. So one thing you can do is come back to that point you've been making. So this is actually the technique that is used in the last two examples that I gave you. In Wild, Cheryl Strayed comes back to the initial point she was making, and she does it with a single word, breathe. She waited me out until my hands fell into her palms, and I took a breath and came back to life. So that's still the flashback. And now in the present day story, she says, breathe. Can I ride my horse? My mother asked the real doctor. So she's just come back to the point, and that gets us back into the present day timeline. So in Where You End and I Begin, the flashback ends with, he said it was cruel to let an animal suffer. So that's the end of the flashback. And to get back into the main story, she comes back to this point. Adrian was suffering. I could see that. So what is another way that Leah McLaren could have gotten us out of this flashback and back into the main story? I'm just going to make this up for the sake of example. I looked at Adrian now at his little hamster body frozen stiff. So why did I give you that example? Because that leads us into tip number 2. The second way to get out of a flashback is to just pick up where you left off in the main story and also use the word now. This is what Ashley Ford does in Somebody's Daughter. I taught myself to sleep lightly, to feel the difference between the window and the bar on my face. As I try to sleep now, the light vibration of driving down the highway soothing me, I dream of the tea set I'd left behind and the farm where I could be anything and anywhere I wanted with a little imagination. So she inserts the flashback, and then to get us back into the main story, she just picks up where she left off with her main story, and she also inserts the word now. Tip number 3, give us a line of dialogue from the main storyline. So sometimes it can work to insert a line of dialogue to let your reader know that we are out of the flashback and back into the main storyline. So let me go back to Cheryl Strayed's example. Let's say she did not insert the word breathe. Maybe she doesn't even need it here. With the line of dialogue said by her mother, we immediately know that we're back to the main storyline. Can I ride my horse? My mother asked the real doctor. So there's no doctor in the flashback, so it's obvious to your reader that we're immediately back to the main storyline. This technique also could have worked in Where You End and I Begin. So the flashback ends with, he said it was cruel to let an animal suffer. So she could have added, this is not what she did, this is my example, I've made this up. The author could have ended by inserting a line of dialogue from her mother. Maybe there's still hope, my mother said. We could rush him to the vet. So because her mother wasn't in the flashback, it's immediately clear that we have come back to the main storyline. So just to review, there are 3 ways to get out of a flashback. 1, come back to the original point of the flashback. 2, pick up where the main story left off and use the word now. 3, insert a line of dialogue from the main storyline. I hope you found these tips helpful. If you did, please be sure to click like and subscribe. I'll see you next time, guys. Take care.